Tonight what we're going to talk about is we're going to start with the ABCs of behavior. We're going to talk about understanding antecedents, and we're going to focus on three common ones in particular. We're going to talk about overstimulation, emotions, and need attainment. We're going to talk about responding to behavior, and then we're going to talk about the impacts of trauma a little bit. So to start off with, who am I and why am I talking about this? So I'm Elizabeth Kraatz. I was formerly a middle school science teacher. I taught adult ed for a while. And then I got interested in psychology through kind of seeing some of the struggles that my students were going through and that kind of thing as I was teaching. And so I got my doctorate degree in educational psychology, and that's what led me here. I'm also a foster and adoptive parent, which is what kind of started me down studying trauma particularly. I will say I am not a clinician. So my perspective is a little bit different. We don't study how to, kind of treat one particular child. It's more a look at, like, in general, when we study hundreds or even thousands of parents, what are the behaviors that tend to lead to positive outcomes for children? That kind of stuff, more than it is kind of making a plan or a diagnosis or anything like that for individual kids. We'll jump right into the ABCs of behavior. So the ABCs of behavior stands for the antecedent, the behavior, and then the consequence, right? So if we think about behavior as nothing more or less than a method of communication, right? Behavior is just how we communicate things. And oftentimes kids, especially as they're younger, they don't have the words and the skills to verbalize what they're feeling. And so that comes out as a variety of behaviors, right? And so the antecedent is what comes before that behavior and triggers it, kind of kicks it off, right? And so if we can understand what the antecedent is, what is causing this behavior in this kid, a lot of times we can set them up for success and kind of prevent bad behaviors before they even happen. Then we have the behavior itself, so the kid does something, and then the consequence is what happens as a result of that behavior, right? So we're gonna think about, why is this kid behaving this way, especially in this context, right? What is it that this child's behavior is communicating to me in this moment? And so, kids aren't really malicious. They're not really manipulative, right? They are simply communicating through their behavior as best they know how, right? They might do really mean things, but that's usually from a lack of understanding of the consequences of that and what is, socially appropriate, more than it is intentionally hurting someone else, right? And so if we can kind of step outside of that and take out the personal, right, then we can understand what it is that kids are trying to tell us through their behavior. So like I said, we're going to talk about three particular antecedents. We've got overstimulation, or a feeling of being overwhelmed, and oftentimes kids can't express that that's what's going on. Kids, and adults too, have big feelings, right? And even, I'm sure we all know some adults who are not great at expressing those big feelings in healthy and verbal ways, right? And kids are the same way. And a lot of times, they may not even have words for what they're feeling. They may not have the vocabulary for it. And so that comes out as behavior. And as an example of this, 2 of my 4 kids have diagnosed anxiety. And the way that that came about was there were major tantrums. I'm talking hitting, kicking, screaming, throwing things, cussing, you name it. And we're like, what is going on? Like, this is not, nothing's happening that should be triggering a tantrum in this moment, right? And we, when they were calm, sat down and had some conversations with them, trying to understand. And what it turned out was that there was anxiety, and they were trying to avoid going into the situation that made them anxious, right? Were they able to say, hey, I'm throwing a tantrum because this is going to make me anxious and I don't want to go over there? No, right? But going over there meant bad things to them. And so they were throwing a tantrum over here to avoid going over there, right? And once we dealt with the anxiety, which for my kids meant therapy and medical treatment through psychiatry, those behaviors are gone. Haven't seen them in months or years, depending on which kid we're talking about, right? So if we can understand the antecedent, right, and it's not always that clean cut that it's going to be totally gone, right? But if we can help them know how to deal with those big feelings, help them cope, then a lot of times we can avoid those really big, unpleasant behaviors. And then finally, need fulfillment. Sometimes acting out is the only way kids know to get attention. Especially we see this in kids with trauma, right? If they don't know how to get positive attention from an adult, guess what? Screaming profanities across the room, that is a great way to get adults to pay attention to you, right? And so if they, we all have this need for attention. If they're not getting that met in other ways, then we may see them engaging in some unpleasant or unfortunate behaviors. So we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with overstimulation. And to think about this, I want you to take just a minute. And I want you to think about all the things that are touching you right at this moment. Your clothes, the chair, your shoes, the floor. We've got enough room in here that probably not the person next to you is touching you, right? But like all the things that are touching you. Then all the things that you can hear, right? Whether that's the little hum of this thing or the air, right? All the things that you can see, smell, taste. If you just ate dinner and you have like a weird taste in your mouth, right? That is a lot of sensory input all of the time. And then you add on to that emotions, thoughts, feelings, right? Anything like that. That's a lot to process, right? Like that's a lot. And so this looks a little scary. Don't worry about it. It's not. But we're going to look at this through the lens of information processing theory. And this is even taking outside the thoughts and feelings. So we're just going to pretend that those thoughts and feelings don't exist for just a minute. And we're just going to think about processing sensory input, right? And what this model is telling us is that we have what's called sensory memory. That's all you can think about, like your nerve endings, right? Your eardrums, what collects all of the stimuli from the environment around you. Whatever you pay attention to gets processed, right? So hopefully you're paying attention to what I'm saying, which means that your brain is processing it and telling you what it is that you hear. That's your working memory, right? Then you have the opportunity to encode that, store it away to refer to back later, right? Our working memory has a limited capacity, and we can only handle so much cognitive load. The average person can handle 7 to 9 pieces of discrete information in their working memory at any given time, right? And as adults, if your shoes are really uncomfortable, you can probably choose not to think about that, right? You notice it, you're like, ooh, that's really uncomfortable, and then you move on. And you're like, nope, I'm going to pay attention to this stuff over here. Little kids can't do that, right? That's something that we learn to do with age. So even just talking physical sensory, taking out the emotions and the thoughts, right? Little kids are already really prone to be overwhelmed because they can't tune out the noise from the air. They can't tune out the fact that their shoes are pinching their toes, right? And so their brain is constantly trying to process all of this information, and that leads to a feeling of being overwhelmed, right? And so it's no wonder that little kids get overstimulated and overwhelmed so easily, right? So as we're thinking about how can we support kids who are feeling overstimulated or overwhelmed, right? First, we're not going to add to it, right? We're not going to interrogate them about why they're upset, right? We're not going to ask them a bunch of questions. We are not going to touch them unless you know this kid and you know that that kind of touch is beneficial to them, right? Because sometimes that's just one more thing you got to process, right? We can help calm the environment. So if they're in a noisy, chaotic environment, maybe we take them in a hallway, right? Maybe we can add noise-canceling headphones. Some kids who have a hard time processing a lot of sensory information, that's really helpful for them, right? We can help them calm their environment. We can give them time, space, and simple choices, right? So sometimes they just need time to like look over there and then look over there and look over there. And once they've done that, they're okay, right? Other times we can say something like, hey, it looks like you're getting really overwhelmed. I know it's really noisy in here. Would you like to sit down right here, or would you like to go in the hall with me? Right? Simple choice. Would you like to stay where you're at, or would you like to come get a hug from me? Right? We're not going to overwhelm them by giving them too many choices, but we're still putting the ball in their court, right? It's their control. Now, if you find that a kid seems to be getting more upset as you're asking them questions, then don't, right? But for a lot of kids, having the control, that sense of like, I choose what's happening to me in this moment, it can be really helpful. We're going to make sure that we're patient and understanding, and we're not going to minimize, right? Because the feeling is very real for a kid, even if as an adult you're like, that's really stupid, right? Just forget about your shoes for a minute, right? They can't do that. Their brains haven't developed that ability yet, right? So our next big one is emotions, right? And if you think about all the things, if you get really, really, really angry, that affects how you perceive the world around you. It affects how you feel, what you think, how your heart beats, your blood pressure, the feeling in your face, maybe your hands shake a little bit, the tone of your voice, right? It infects your entire being. And we're adults who have been taught how to control our emotions, and we still get that, right? And so emotions, big emotions that kids don't know what to do with, can be a major trigger for some big behaviors, right? So we know as adults how to control our emotions. We call that emotional self-regulation. And there's a series of factors that contribute to whether or not someone will exhibit self-regulation in a given situation, right? The first is biology. Are you old enough to have developed the cognitive capacity to control your own thoughts and feelings, right? There's also somewhat a personality temperament kind of deal, right? Some people are really hot-headed. This is really hard for them. For other people, it's easier. It comes more naturally, right? Then we have explicit skills. These are things that we can teach and learn. Things like, if you have a toddler, you might start with something like taking deep breaths, right? Or even something as simple as like you need to remove yourself from this situation and go to the hallway for a little bit, right? That's a skill, recognizing when you need to take a break and then doing that. And then we have motivation. Do I want to control myself in this instance? For instance, if throwing a tantrum gets you lots of attention, you might not want to control that, right? And then we've got caregiver support, which we'll talk about, and then the environmental context, right? If you've ever taken a kid to like a kids museum, that is not a context that supports self-regulation, right? Because they go psycho crazy as soon as they go through the door, and they run and they scream and they throw things, right? That's not to say don't take them there. It just means be prepared that they are not going to be able to self-regulate in that context, right? At home, in a place where they know, in a place that is calm, where everything is expected, right? That it's going to be a lot easier to self-regulate than in someplace new. So as we're thinking about how we go about emotion regulation, Gross said that we've got 5 different opportunities for engagement in emotion regulation, right? We select which situations we go to, right? For instance, you might choose not to go to a party where there's going to be somebody you really don't like because you don't want to deal with that, right? That's situation selection. You're choosing what situations to put yourself in, right? Or we can then, we're in the situation, we can modify it. For instance, there have been a few times when my phone's buzzed, I've looked at it, I've gotten an email, and I know from who sent it that it is going to make me mad, right? I am in that situation. I have that email. But I can modify that situation by choosing not to read it right before I go teach a class, right? I have modified that situation in a way that supports more productive emotion regulation. We can choose what we pay attention to, right? For instance, you're at a party, your ex is there, flirting with somebody in the corner, and other people are over here doing karaoke. You can choose to pay attention to that and not that, right? That's emotion regulation. Then we have cognitive change. One way of doing that is reappraisal, is what it's called. And that's when you change how you're thinking about the situation. Maybe you find a silver lining, right? Maybe you just try to look at something from someone else's perspective, understand where they're coming from, right? And we know that actually there's a lot of well-being and other benefits that come from being able to do that. So that one's a particularly important skill. And then finally, you've had this emotional response. We have response modulation, right? Now that I'm feeling angry, what do I do with that? How do I cope, right? And so as we're thinking about coping, we've got 2 main types of coping strategies. We've got problem-focused and we've got emotion-focused. So for instance, if I'm doing my homework and I get really frustrated because I don't understand, I don't know what's expected of me, I don't know what to do. A problem-focused solution would be to go to my professor for help or go to the tutoring center for help, right? I have addressed the root cause of my frustration, thus resolving the problem. That's a problem-focused strategy. Emotion-focused strategy would be like, I'm feeling really frustrated, so I'm going to go for a walk until I feel better, right? Dealing with the symptoms of the emotion, if you will, right? When possible, problem-focused is preferable, right? If you're really angry with somebody and you can sit down and have a rational conversation with them, that's better because it gets to the root cause of your anger. Otherwise, you might feel better for a little while, but then when you re-engage with that person, you're going to get angry all over again, right? However, sometimes, maybe right in this moment, you're too mad to have a rational conversation with that person. So you need to go for a walk first and then deal with the problem, right? And we can model this for our kids. One of the things that I've tried really hard to do, I'm not always perfect at it, but is that when one of my kids, especially my older ones, makes me really, really mad, is I tell them, you know, hey, I am not calm enough to have a discussion with you about your choices right now, so I need you to go to your room. I'm gonna take a break for 10 minutes, and when I am calmer, I will come have a conversation with you, right? Because then, on the one hand, I am first making sure that my anger does not negatively influence my interaction with my child, but also I am modeling the fact that I need to calm down and not react out of anger, right? So I'm kind of serving two purposes with that. And then, so as we're thinking about how kids learn to do this, how kids learn to self-regulate and cope with their emotions, we do this through what's called co-regulation. So little kids especially, we're thinking, you know, kindergartners right now, they are not physically capable of fully self-regulating. They're just not. And so we do what's called co-regulation, which is where we as the adult take on some of the responsibility for the regulation of that emotion. And we can do that in 3 different ways. We can provide a warm, responsive relationship, making sure that we are really understanding what is going on with this child and that we are responding accordingly, right? Making sure that they feel heard and seen and cared for. We're going to teach and coach self-regulation skills, right? If you're talking with a really little one, that might look like practicing blowing out the candles, right? You know, we've blown out 1, we've blown out 2, because then we're getting them to take deep breaths, right? With older kids, it might be things like knowing when to take breaks, right? Knowing that their homework is getting them so frustrated that they can't make progress. So that's a time to go take a break, right? Those kinds of things. And then we're going to structure the environment. We are going to make sure that when we are expecting kids to self-regulate and start engaging in those processes, that we're giving them a supportive environment where they know what to expect, they feel safe, all of those things, right? And it's really important to notice that caregivers' capacity for co-regulation depends on their own ability to self-regulate. If you can't control yourself, you cannot co-regulate with a child, right? An escalated adult cannot de-escalate an escalated child. So you have to get your own self calm before you can engage with that kid in any kind of healthy and effective way. So as we're thinking about how we can support emotion regulation, first we're going to explicitly teach and model skills, right? One of my kids had a really hard time recognizing his own emotions. Like he would not notice that he was getting angry until he was so angry that he exploded. And that's not uncommon with kids, particularly kids with trauma. And so we did a lot of body scans, right? Okay, you are mad. What does your stomach feel like? What does your heart feel like? What do your hands feel like, right? Because if they're balled up into fists, that's a clue. What does your face feel like, right? To try to help him be able to recognize, hey, I am getting mad, so I need to use a strategy and get myself out of this situation before I explode and, you know, punch someone in the face or whatever it was he was going to do in that moment, right? So we can teach those skills, and then they also need to see us using those skills, right? You can do as much teaching of skills as you want, but then if they see you yelling at people every time you get mad, right, then that's not modeling that emotion coping and emotion regulation. We're going to talk kids through their emotional reactions, make sure they have the vocabulary to explain and understand their emotions, that they're able to communicate those, that they can connect, this is what happens, so this is how I feel, and now here's what I can do about it, right? We can talk them through that and take some of that cognitive load off of them. We can provide time and comfort, even when they caused the issue themselves. They still oftentimes need comfort. Don't try to teach while kids are escalated. They cannot learn. If a kid is really upset because you told them that playing like that was going to break their toy, and then their toy broke, they're not going to be able to learn a lesson about listening to you next time while they're upset, right? So we need to calm them down, and then we can revisit the whole like, hey, you were warned, you still made the choice that you made, right? Remain calm and regulated yourself, and then don't minimize or stigmatize kids' emotions. So just because it's the stupidest thing you've ever heard in your life does not mean that the feeling is not real to them. For instance, my 3-year-old got so upset last week, sobbing, because one of the boys opened the van door on her side and she wanted them to open the van door on the other side. Like, that's the stupidest thing, right? My 6-year-old regularly cries because the bowl he wanted to put his cereal in was dirty. But to him, that's real, right? And so by telling him, hey, just suck it up and get over it, that's not going to help him regulate. Now, I'm not going to go out of my way to wash the bowl and give him exactly what he wants, right? But I can help him feel better and then be like, hey, let's think about this. Is this something that we really need to be super upset about? Probably no. But he needs to be calm before we can have that conversation, right? And then also recognizing that no emotions are bad emotions. They can be unpleasant, but they're not bad, right? They're just a clue as to what is going on in our world. I can't tell you how many of my college students, my boys, have told me that they were told that men don't get sad, men get mad. And they were explicitly taught to translate any negative emotion into anger. And that leads to, or told not to cry, you know, suck it up and be a man, whatever. And that leads to young men who can't express their emotions in a healthy way, right? Who can't engage in emotional intimacy with a partner, for example, right? And so recognizing that everybody feels a range of human emotion, and that's fine, right? It's okay to be mad. It's not okay to punch your sister because you're mad, but it's okay to be mad, right? And we can teach kids that distinction. All right, and then our last antecedent that we're going to talk about is need fulfillment, and thinking through how kids get their needs and their wants met. So self-determination theory says that we have 3 basic psychological needs, and we could talk about needs all night long, but for tonight, this is what we're going to talk about. So it says that our 3 basic psychological needs are competence, a sense of being able to competently deal with our lives, autonomy, being in control of your own self, right? And then relatedness, which is a sense of being connected to and respected by other people. And kids, humans, will act in whatever way they need to get these needs met. For instance, I used to teach 8th grade, and 8th graders they're a trip. But one thing that we know about adolescents is that they are shifting from adults being the center of their approval, right? Little kids want adult approval. They need friends for socialization and that kind of stuff, right? But they really want adult approval. They become adolescents, they care a lot less about adult approval and a lot more about peer approval, right? So you take a room full of 8th graders, if they are not having a sense of relatedness with their peers, they don't feel like they're getting adequate connection with peers, they may start clowning in your classroom and saying inappropriate things because it gets everybody else to laugh, right? All my classmates are laughing, that means they're paying attention to me. And so students are meeting this need for relatedness in a really inappropriate way that's not conducive to learning, but that might be the only way they know to meet that need, right? Same thing with competence. You'll see a lot of times kids who feel incompetent in a class, maybe they're not reading on par with everybody else, they may act out to distract everybody else from the fact that they can't read, maybe even themselves, right? Because they don't want everybody to know that they can't read. They don't want to sit there and not be able to read like everybody else is. So they start doing something obnoxious, right? Autonomy, teenagers are famous for this one, right? Because at about the same time that we shift from needing adult approval to peer approval, we also have vastly increasing needs for autonomy, right? Teenagers as a group tend to hate being told what to do. They don't like feeling controlled. And so if they can't make their own choices, then they can make the choice to not follow your choices, right? And that's how a lot of teenagers get known for rebellion, right? But what we find is that when environments are structured to provide a sense of autonomy, to give developmentally appropriate choice and control, a lot of that teenage rebellion goes away, right? And we see that a lot in middle schools, that if we can have really well-designed middle schools, a lot of the bad stuff that happens in middle schools, you know, well-being tanks, grades tank, learning tanks, peer relationships tank, a lot of that goes away, and kids can continue being happy, healthy, well-performing kids if they are supported in having their psychological needs met. So as we're thinking about how to support kids in meeting their psychological needs, we need to provide opportunities for success experiences. That does not mean make them successful at everything, right? But it means that they need to have times when they feel like they've done well, they've succeeded. And keep criticisms constructive. There are times when finding something that a kid is doing well is a struggle, right? But making sure that you're kind of picking your battles as to what things you're criticizing, and then keeping those criticisms productive, right? So this is not an appropriate choice. Let's think through how we could make a different choice next time instead of just telling them they're doing it wrong, right? Give kids chances to make their own choices and fail in developmentally appropriate ways. Kids need to fail. Right now, we're not going to let our 3-year-old run into the road because that's a failure that is outsized for their age and development, right? But as they get older, they need bigger and bigger chances to make their own choice and then deal with the consequences of that choice. Because we know, for instance, that coping with failure develops neurological pathways that enable us to use those coping skills in the future, right? And so if we can develop that when we have adult support, right? We have a grown-up there to provide comfort, provide advice, provide support, then we can develop that ability to cope with failure, the knowledge of how to do that in a relatively safe environment, and we become adults who can handle the inevitable failures that we all experience, right? But when kids are too protected, and we all want to protect our kids, right? Like that's our go-to. But if we protect them too much, then they become adults who have never had to cope with failure. Right? You see it a lot, kids who were like straight A students, and then suddenly they get to college and it's a lot harder than high school, and they have no idea how to cope with not getting straight A's. Right? It's not uncommon. They never had to cope with failure. And whether or not that one had to do anything with their parents, I don't know. Right? But kids need chances to fail. If you're interested in that, there's a really great, if you Google NPR, how to parent a self-driven child, they're interviewing some authors, they're neuroscientists, talking about how failure actually changes our neural connections in our brains. It's really, really cool. We need to talk with kids to hear their ideas and opinions, making sure that their thoughts are being taken into consideration, that even if you don't go with what they want, just being heard and understood increases a sense of autonomy. Make age-appropriate decisions with kids collaboratively. Make sure that you are explaining the reasoning behind rules and expectations that you have for kids. It feels a lot less controlling if I understand that a rule is for my safety and my benefit than if it's just because my mom said so, right? So we can take away that sense of being controlled by making sure kids understand why certain things are or are not okay. Show kids you respect their individuality. Let them make their own choices as much as you can, as much as they are able to. Connect with kids on their level and then provide supportive opportunities for peer engagement. And some kids, especially kids with trauma, need explicit teaching on how to engage with peers because they genuinely don't know, right? So they may need you to sit down. I can remember I had to explain to my 11-year-old when he was, probably 8, because he would go over and talk to our neighbors, and our poor neighbors would have like arms full of groceries and they're like trying to like inch away from him, and he would just keep talking and following them. Right? And so finally we had to have a conversation that like, if someone keeps stepping away from you and turning their body away, that means that they're done talking to you, right? But that was not a social cue that he could pick up on his own. He had to be explicitly taught, right? Or like making comment or asking strangers how often they kiss their spouse is not cool. You can't do that, right? Like that's not okay. But like he wasn't able to naturally pick up on those social cues and he had to get explicitly taught. And that's not uncommon for kids. So they may have to get taught how to engage with peers in a healthy way. All right, so now let's move on to the B, the behavior, right? My kid did something unacceptable. What do I do about it? So now we're moving into the consequence of that behavior, right? The C part. So should you ignore the behavior? Behaviors are often best ignored if it is unlikely to reoccur, right? Your kid is so excited that it is Christmas that they chuck something across the room. Probably they're not going to break rules about chucking things across the room tomorrow when it's not Christmas. So that's a time to just like let it go, right? If it is attention seeking and not dangerous. So if a kid is screaming bloody murder for no reason other than to get your attention, ignoring might be the way to go, right? As long as that's not dangerous, because obviously if it's dangerous, we need to intervene. So we can also have responses that are not giving consequences, not saying like, here is your punishment for this, right? We can do things like cueing. So that might be like, I look at somebody and I'm like, right? And they know like, check yourself, right? Or you like, give them one of these, right? You're cueing the behavior that you want without having to really like punish anything, right? We can give verbal corrections. Hey, that's not kind language. We don't talk like that to each other. Right? We can use proximity. This is a great one as a teacher. Because let's say Tara's over here goofing off, right? If I just walk over, I'm not going to do it because I'll mess up the camera, right? But if I just walk over and stand next to her, most of the time she'll quit doing whatever she's doing, right? So we can just use our physical presence. We can prod for reflection, like, hey, it seems like you're having a hard time following rules right now. Let's stop and talk about what's going on, right? Prod them to reflect. Provide that emotion regulation support that we talked about. Give positive attention. So maybe they're yelling across the room, and they're not supposed to be, and you ignore that, but you praise them for sitting nicely in their chair, right? Especially when kids don't know how to seek attention appropriately, and so they're trying to get your attention by yelling at them. You're not going to give attention for the yelling. You're going to give attention for something that they're doing well, right? Teaching them how to get positive attention. Oh, hey, adults pay attention to me, and they don't yell at me if I do what they want me to, right? And then autonomy support, giving choices, right? One thing that my kid's behavioral psychologist recommended was that when we start having behaviors escalate, that we give a choice. You can either go to the calm down corner and we can read a story and calm down together, or you can go sit in timeout because the choices that you're making are not acceptable. Then it's in her court. Does she want to use the self-regulation strategies with help, or does she want to go have a consequence and continue making bad choices, right? It's up to her. And then finally, as we're thinking about sometimes kids do things that are so unacceptable, we have to give them consequences. So they need to be consequences that are motivating for the child. If they don't care, it's not going to change their behavior, right? It should be logical and not harsh. So what I mean by logical is like, you took someone else's toy and then broke it, so now you have to do enough chores to earn money to buy a new toy, right? That stems directly from their choice. You ruined something that belonged to somebody else, so now you have to fix it by replacing it, right? Versus you broke your sibling's toy, so now you don't get to watch TV, right? There's no logical connection between those things. They should encourage reflection and improvement. So we need to sit down and think about, why did you get this consequence? Because a lot of times kids don't know why they got a consequence, and they'll think it's for something totally unrelated to what it's actually for. So making sure that they tell you, why are you getting this consequence? Why are you in timeout right now? And then what caused that and what can we do differently in the future? Be delivered in a calm, rational manner. So you are not in trouble because I'm mad at you. You are in trouble because of the choice that you made, and that's not acceptable. Explain why the behavior was unacceptable, right? I realized after, I don't know, a year of having my oldest that he had no idea what the word disrespectful meant. No clue. So when I was telling him, like, hey, that's not acceptable, that's disrespectful, that meant nothing to him, right? Until we sat down and we explained, like, what is respect? And why is it important? And how can we show respect to each other? And then he's like, oh, okay, I can do that. If only it didn't take me a year to get there, right? They need to be close in time. We call that contiguity. So if it takes 2 days for that consequence to occur, it's going to be a lot less effective than if we can do it immediately. And the younger the kid is, the more immediate that consequence needs to be. 10 minutes is too long for a 3-year-old, right? Whereas when they get to be older, you could say something that even happens this evening might be effective. They need to be age appropriate, obviously, and then given within the context of a responsive, loving relationship. So kids need to know that no matter what they do, you will never love them less. You are not giving them consequences because you dislike them, because you're angry, because you don't love them. Actually, we give consequences because we love them, right? Because we want them to be successful and happy and healthy. And so we have to teach them that certain behaviors are simply not okay, right? And so kids need to understand the context in which these consequences are being delivered. So now, as we're thinking about trauma affects basically everything about brain development, right? And we could spend days just talking about that. But some of the things that we tend to see with trauma are delayed social emotional skills, which means that kids who've experienced trauma, and I think it's currently something like 60% of all second graders have had at least one instance of major trauma in their life. So this is something that is really common. That could be the death of a parent, could be being in a bad car accident, it could be something like getting put into foster care, right? It's a wide variety of things, but they all affect how kids' brains develop. And so we see a lot of kids who have experienced trauma having lesser skills than we would expect for their age in self-regulation, in social skills, so ability to interact with people. And they also tend to have a harder time, and this is true of kids with ADHD as well, tend to have a harder time connecting their choice to a response, right? And so for them, it's going to take a lot more repetition and a lot more explanations of like, you did this thing, this is the consequence of that thing, right? You said something really mean to your friend, now your friend doesn't want to play with you, right? They have a really hard time understanding that connection, and it takes a lot of repetition and a lot of patience to kind of eventually get there. I'm talking potentially years of repetition to get there. And so kids with trauma especially need all of these things even more, right? And a lot of times we see that their behaviors don't seem logical, right? For instance, my oldest had a lot of school trauma before he came to us, and it took us a while to figure out that every time someone mentioned school, he had an absolute meltdown, complete meltdown that lasted 2 or 3 days, right? Because he had school trauma, right? The hairdresser asking him when school started did not seem like something that should elicit a tantrum. But based on his trauma, that was a connection that his brain made, right? Or if something really scary happened in a car that was green, the next time a kid tries to get in a green car, they may throw a major tantrum, right? Because to them, those things are associated. And so as we're thinking about forming relationships, especially relationships with kids with trauma, we can use this guideline. And this is actually a whole framework for therapy. And if you're interested in it, you can look up the DPP network. There's a bunch more information there. But it's basically a guide to tell us how to structure our interactions with kids. So first, we're going to start with playfulness. How can we make this playful? Whether we make it a game, whether we make it funny, we tell jokes. My 3-year-old, we noticed we were having a really hard time and a lot of defiance at bath time. She didn't want to get in the bathtub. So we started making up silly songs about bath time. And guess what? Just doing that got rid of that problem, right? So how can we make it a game? Making sure that we are being accepting. We are accepting that child and their thoughts and their feelings 100%, right? That doesn't mean we have to accept their behavior, but we are accepting them and what they are thinking and what they are feeling. We're being curious about what they're thinking, what they're feeling, why they're feeling that way, what their behavior is telling us. And then finally, we're showing empathy, right? We're making sure that they feel seen and heard and understood to the greatest extent possible. And that can help us build relationships, and we know relationships are the foundation for everything that comes afterwards, right? So in sum, right, we can support kids in developing healthy behaviors by seeing those behaviors as nothing more or less than communication, right? And then being curious about them. What is this behavior telling me? And how can we move forward? And then we can support kids in developing the skills that they need to handle things like emotions and anger and all of that stuff effectively. So that is my contact info here at the college. So if you would like references, readings, anything like that from today's presentation, you have questions, comments, I would welcome anything you guys want to send me. So yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. I don't know how to frame it into a question, but maybe a discussion point. Like the word attention was through your presentation a little bit, and then at the end you mentioned ADHD, and just some different brain functions, and as kids grow up, sometimes the timeline is not like as expected. Kind of like you're saying with trauma. So I don't know. I guess just comment on that, or do you see that? I see some similarities between ADHD, autism, trauma. Am I imagining it?
No, not at all. And actually, trauma, I was talking to my kid's psychiatrist, and she's like, honestly, we're kind of rolling the dice because in kids, especially boys, right? Is it trauma? Is it ADHD? Is it anxiety? I don't know. They all have essentially the same visible outward signs, right? And so it's not uncommon at all that trauma looks like ADHD, ADHD looks like trauma. We see similar neurodevelopmental stuff going on, right? ADHD is associated with decreased functioning in the prefrontal cortex, which is our rational decision making, right? Thinking through cause and effect, that kind of stuff. And we see the same, not quite the same, but very, very similar decrease in functioning in both ADHD and kids with trauma. Right, that decreased functioning in the prefrontal cortex, which leads to impulsivity, not good decision making, right, all of that stuff. So yeah, no, you're not imagining it at all.
So along that lines, maybe you can confirm this. Along the lines of ADHD, I had read or gone to a conference or something, and they said that as kids age and they've got ADHD, especially once they hit like the puberty and those really high emotions, that boys in particular with ADHD tend to be about 1 or 2 years behind emotionally than their peers. As far as how their brain can function with that. And so you look at kids who have ADHD, and like my oldest, I think it was something I was doing with him because of him, because they had said he was ADHD, and they said that, and I went, oh, because he was the 14-year-old that couldn't hang out with 14-year-olds, but he could totally chill with 12-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
And because emotionally and socially, that's where his brain was at, and I was just like, oh. But I also know that they throw ADHD out a lot as a first diagnosis because it's easier. That trauma is so is it a trauma response? Is it ADHD? Oh, it must be. And it's just trauma takes a lot more to prove, and it's a dirty road that nobody wants to go down.
It is, yeah. And so if you couldn't hear Tara, she was talking about like, a lot of times kids get diagnosed with ADHD when really maybe it's trauma. And I actually had a psychiatrist say like, hey, ADHD is a lot easier to treat than trauma. So let's start there. And if we don't see a reaction to what would typically be beneficial for a kid with ADHD, then we'll look at other options, right? We'll look at some because you can't medicate away trauma, right? But you can a lot of times provide medication support for kids with ADHD in a way that can help them function. But yeah, no, I don't know the statistics as far as like years behind, but that doesn't surprise me at all. Because if we're thinking about the parts of the brain that are decreased functioning, that makes total sense that you would have lesser social emotional functioning in particularly boys with ADHD. And actually, so like I said, I'm not a clinician, so like diagnostics is not my area. But I have a lot of students who want to go into therapy and that kind of stuff. So I've been studying it more and more. And they just came out with a new version of the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health. And they actually, for some conditions, differentiated the diagnostic criteria between boys and girls. And I know one they did that for was autism, because what they found was that a lot of girls were not getting the support that they need because they didn't show traditional autism signs. And so now there's actually different diagnostic criteria for girls versus boys to try to help make sure that those girls are getting the resources that they need. And I would not be surprised if there's not, I don't have a copy of it yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did something similar for ADHD, because we know we have similar problems where girls don't show, for instance, hyperactivity nearly as often as boys do. And so a lot of times girls don't get a diagnosis when they're young. And then they don't have that support throughout of having an IEP and all of that.
Yeah. I just got recently diagnosed this year.
Did you?
Last year. So.
Thanks for sharing. I can't tell you how many of my female students told me that they did not get diagnosed with ADHD until high school or college. And I've had multiple students tell me that diagnosis actually, literally saved their life, because they were so fed up with themselves and just felt horrible inside because they felt like they were incapable of being successful and doing what everybody else was supposed to be able to do, right? And then getting that medical support was like, oh, it was just something happening in my brain, not that something is bad about me, right? Not that I'm incapable. I just needed medical help for a medical condition, right?
I have a question. Okay, so you talked about those self-driven children. What happens when your kid is completely on the other end of the spectrum and they just have no drive at all, none whatsoever? They have no cares. And there's not a consequence that works because, and it's a trauma response. I know it's a trauma response. I know the what behind the why.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't figured out a way around it. What do I do to connect with her on her level to make her start to care about hygiene, about cleanliness, about schoolwork, about brushing our hair, about not sharing hats with kids who have headlights, cool things like that.
Yeah, we don't want to share hats with people with headlights.
No,
That's bad.
We don't.
So the question is, you've got a kid who's totally unmotivated, who will not take responsibility and accountability for themselves. And a lot of times what we see, especially in kids who've had trauma, is that we have what's called learned helplessness, where they've kind of learned that they don't feel like they're capable, so why bother trying, right? And they just shut down and check out. And we could do a whole nother lesson on human motivation. We spend about 2 weeks on that in my classes usually, because it is so incredibly complex. So the self-determination theory with the 3 psychological needs is actually a theory of motivation. But there's many of them because motivation is so complex. But at the end of the day too, especially as kids are starting to be teenagers, right? There's also a level of like, they have to meet you halfway. You can't force someone to care, right? You can make sure that you're setting them up for success. And if you want to talk through some of that stuff at some point, we can totally do that. But, you know, you can set them up for success. You can structure the environment. You can provide the supportive, caring relationship. You can do all of the right things. But until they are ready to care, it's like taking a kid to therapy. You can force them to go, but you can't make them talk, right? And so if I find the magic bullet for making kids care, I'll let you know. I haven't found it yet.
No questions?
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming.